Thank you for coming on, Donald. It's truly an honor, man.
Oh, man, it's a pleasure. It's always good to have an opportunity to speak to people that are interested in self-improvement and Stoicism.
Great. I wanted to start with, how did you initially get interested in philosophy and therapy?
Well, I write about this a little bit in my latest book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, because the publisher wanted me to write some kind of biographical stuff. So it's kind of a personal thing in a way, because my father passed away when I was about 13, 14 years old. And I remember that he didn't leave that many possessions behind, but in my hometown, most of my friends' fathers were Freemasons, and my father was as well. And it gave him a kind of moral philosophy of life based around Hellenistic philosophy. He left behind some books, and I looked through them, and they mentioned the cardinal virtues and Pythagoras and Plato and stuff like that. And as a kid, I kind of couldn't really understand what all this was about. It seemed quite cryptic to me. So I went away and I read Plato, and I read about philosophy in general, and I kind of got hooked, and I started to read more and more. And I look back now and I kind of think maybe I was looking for a direction in life, like a substitute for a father figure as a teenager. And I turned to philosophy for that reason. And I got deeper and deeper into philosophy and studying psychotherapy and Buddhism, meditation techniques and stuff. And I went to university and I studied philosophy, but it wasn't really giving me what I was looking for somehow. And then after 4 years studying philosophy at Aberdeen University, I left with my degree, and I discovered the Stoics, which is one of the few major schools of philosophy that you don't normally study in an undergraduate curriculum. And the reason being, ironically, academic philosophers will often say that the Stoics didn't come up with any original philosophical arguments or concepts. They borrowed arguments from Plato and Socrates and other earlier thinkers. And they'll say all the Stoics did was to think through the practical application of those ideas. So why would we be interested in that? And so they don't study the Stoics. And so ironically, that's precisely the reason that everyone else is interested in Stoicism. That's why Stoicism has become popular. And I immediately thought, well, I want to understand the practical psychological implications, and I want to work as a counselor and a psychotherapist. And so I immediately spotted that the Stoics were exactly what I'd spent the last 4 years looking for. And the one thing that we hadn't covered, like the stone that's been discarded by the builders, has turned out to be the cornerstone, like the most important thing. And so I became absorbed in Stoicism, and that was, I think, nearly 25 years ago now. And I'm still interested in Stoicism because it still fills that function for me. The way I often describe it to people is that I wanted to help people. So I was studying psychotherapy and counseling, and I wanted to use psychological techniques. So I was learning meditation and self-hypnosis, and I wanted a direction, a philosophy of life. So I was studying Socrates and Plato and Heidegger and Wittgenstein and stuff. And I felt like I was reading loads and loads of books. And then when I discovered the Stoics, it all kind of crystallized into one thing, because I got all three of these things in one place. And I remember at the time smiling to myself and kind of laughing and thinking, now I only need to read one lot of books. I don't have to read all these. I don't have to read Heidegger anymore, and Jung and Freud and all that stuff. I could just read the Stoics, and I get the contemplative practices and the philosophy of life, and it's the philosophical basis for cognitive therapy as well. So everything just clicked, came neatly together for me.
So when did you start to see the similarities between cognitive behavioral therapy and the Stoics? Was it right away? And what techniques have you used in your practice that are from the Stoics?
Well, I could see immediately that it was relevant. And the strange thing was, I was reading the works of a French academic called Pierre Hadot, and he was interested in the history of philosophy, and he'd written extensively about the psychological techniques that I found in Stoicism and other schools of Hellenistic philosophy. But he called them spiritual exercises. And so it seemed to me there was a glaring omission in Hadot's exceptional work, that he never really made any connection at all with modern psychology or psychotherapy. So, good books often kind of write themselves. And so my first book kind of wrote itself. I read Haddo, and I think obviously all of these spiritual exercises that he finds in the Stoics could be compared to psychological techniques that we do in CBT. That seems like really obvious. And so I thought someone needs to write a book about this. And I wrote a book called The Philosophy of CBT, and that's what it was about. And so I go into great detail, and there were identified 18 distinct psychological strategies, I think, roughly. So lots of different psychological techniques that are similar. But the thing that makes it really obvious is that the pioneers of cognitive therapy would typically quote Epictetus, one of the most famous Stoic teachers. And there's a quote from Enchiridion 5, the handbook of Epictetus. The Enchiridion, we call it in Greek. And passage number 5 says, it's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them. And every cognitive therapist should know that quote. It's in most of the early books in cognitive therapy. It's a cliche in cognitive therapy because it happens to express the basic theoretical premise of cognitive therapy, which we call the cognitive theory of emotion. And the cognitive theory of emotion is the idea that our emotions are typically shaped by underlying corresponding beliefs. So if someone's anxious, it's because they believe that something threatening is about to happen and that they're not able to cope with it. And the thing is, as soon as you take feelings and identify the underlying beliefs, magic happens. Something big happens. A big deal happens. Everything changes because those beliefs can be true or false, and you can evaluate the evidence for them. And beliefs can also be contradictory. So if I say I'm anxious, and I say, but it's driving me crazy, it's ruining my relationships, it's interfering with my work. And the therapist might say, well, why don't you do something about it? I might say, it's just how I feel. I can't help it, right? And that's the end of the conversation. But Albert Ellis, one of the pioneers of cognitive therapy, who'd read the Stoics, used to say, but it's not just how you feel, it's also how you think. And if we identify the underlying thoughts, they might be false, or they might be distorted or exaggerated. So that opens up a whole toolbox for therapists of various ways that they can help people to challenge and question those underlying thoughts and develop awareness of them. And the Stoics were doing something similar 2,500 years ago. So the cognitive theory of emotion, we have research and complicated theories. The job of a therapist, in some regards, is a job of translation or presentation. So evidence-based psychotherapists read research studies that get quite technical, and then they sit in a little room with a stranger and they have to explain it to them, right? And it could be a 15-year-old kid, or it could be an old lady, or it could be any random person. So the therapist has to be able to put it in layman's terms, in plain English. You have to understand the research, but translate it into simple language. And so early cognitive therapists said, well, the easiest way to do that is just to say, it's basically like what Epictetus said. It's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them. And people generally seem to understand that quote. And I thought, so there's a connection, not just a kind of trivial connection, but the central foundation, the premise of cognitive therapy is taken from Stoicism. And so there are other influences of Stoicism on cognitive therapy, but if you start from the same premise, you would independently arrive at similar conclusions anyway, right? Sometimes Stoicism is different, sometimes CBT is different, but they're moving in a similar direction because they begin from almost exactly the same starting point. So techniques would be, the most obvious one is just Socratic questioning. It's a trivial point to make, that if you believe that our emotions are based on beliefs, then you would ask people questions to identify contradictory beliefs that they have and identify evidence that they're aware of that might conflict with their beliefs, a bit like Socrates did. So you ask questions of people, you say, where's the evidence for that? Can you think of alternative ways of looking at the same situation that might be more realistic or more helpful? And So just questioning methods are one of the first tools. And then modeling techniques, the Stoics did. So how would someone courageous or wise view the same problem? What would they say to themselves when they're confronted with the same misfortune that you're facing? And then maybe you could emulate their, not just their behavior, but also their way of looking at and interpreting things. And so those are just two techniques, but there's a whole bunch of other things that Stoicism and CBT have in common.
The last one you mentioned, if I'm not wrong, is the Stoic mindfulness technique, right?
That's kind of actually more related. I'd relate that more to the first one that I mentioned. So this idea that it's not things that upset us, but our opinions about them. There's something very powerful and very subtle underlying that. And actually, psychotherapists didn't realize how powerful it was until about 15, 20 years ago. So in the 1950s, therapists started to say to their clients, it's not things that upset us, it's our opinions about them. And then they would use that as the starting point, and then they'd get them to evaluate the evidence. And over the last 20 years or so, there's been a revolution in psychotherapy based on research evidence, converging studies that suggest that this starting point might be more important than we previously realized. So we call the ability to distinguish between our beliefs and external events cognitive distancing. That's the technical term that we use to refer to it, right? So if the way that Aaron Beck, one of the founders of cognitive therapy, described it is, imagine you're wearing rose-tinted glasses and you've been wearing them for many years, so you forget that you're wearing them and you just think, that dude's pink, that house is pink, right? That little dog over there is pink, right? Because you just think everything is pink because you've never taken the glasses off, right? It's how it looks to you. And then somebody comes on and knocks your glasses off. And then you suddenly realize, you go, oh, the dog isn't pink. Like, it's the lenses that are pink, but I was looking through them, right? When you look through them, you blend or fuse or merge the color with the external event that you're looking at, the external object that you're looking at, right? It's kind of hard to separate them. But once you've taken them off and you kind of realize, then you can bear in mind, you can like recognize the fact that you're looking through the pinkness, right? And it's coloring everything. Now, imagine for a moment that you're wearing catastrophe colored glasses. Like your girlfriend dumps you, or you fail an exam, or you lose your job, and you're looking at it through catastrophe-tinted glasses. Now, the Stoics would say that catastrophe doesn't exist in nature. Nature doesn't know what a catastrophe is. There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. It's just a physical event. It's just a jumble of atoms. You're the one that decides it's awful, like, oh, someone's a terrible person. These value judgments are entirely projected by us onto external events. Now, we might feel justified in doing that, but nevertheless, they don't exist in nature. Like, there's just objective facts in nature. We impose the values on it. So whenever we say somebody's awful or a situation's a catastrophe, we're looking through these tinted glasses. And I can say that you're big or small. Like, I can say that someone's got dark hair or light hair or blue eyes or brown eyes. Or I can say that they're a terrible person. And it looks like I'm just describing facts, like I'm attributing qualities to them. But some of those are physical properties. And then some of them are moral judgments, value judgments. The value judgments aren't just a description of facts. They come from in me. Like, they're not a description of an external event. But I confuse the two all the time. The Stoics think we're always confusing those two. So Marcus Aurelius keeps saying you have to separate your thoughts from external reality, what we call gaining cognitive distance today. Now, early cognitive therapists thought, look, you have to do that first, and then you can weigh up the evidence. So a cognitive therapist might say someone's lost their job, and they might say this is a complete disaster. And the therapist might say, well, where's the evidence for that? Or can you imagine another way of looking at it? Or what are the pros and cons of looking at it that way? And so Aaron Beck would say, first of all, you have to get the person to realize that there are other ways of viewing it, and that this isn't a description of objective reality. There's an arbitrariness about it. Otherwise, they won't feel as if their description is even up for debate. They have to view it as a hypothesis rather than a fact. Otherwise, they won't begin to evaluate the evidence. So the client might just say, but it is a catastrophe, it just is. And that guy hasn't got enough cognitive distance to even start looking at the evidence, right? He can't imagine another way of looking at it, right? So he said, look, you've got to get people to separate their thoughts from reality first, then you can start the disputation or weighing up the evidence. But later, cognitive therapy researchers, Stephen Hayes and his research team in particular, what we call the third wave of cognitive therapy, said, what happens if you just do the first part on its own and you don't even bother doing the disputation? What happens if you just, they called it comprehensive distancing at first. What happens if you just really hammer home this idea that our value judgments and other thoughts come from inside us and we're projecting them onto reality? And what they found was that was, in many cases, as effective as all the other techniques that we use in cognitive therapy. And actually, the Stoics put more emphasis on this. So to come back to your original question, the mindfulness, the Stoics call that prosophi, which just means paying attention. And what they want us to pay attention to are our value judgments. And they want us to continually throughout the day notice the way that our value judgments influence our emotions and our behavior, and to realize that we're imposing them on external events. They want us to continually maintain cognitive distancing by realizing that there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so, and that it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. And that's a continual state of mind for the Stoic wise man or woman, the sophos. So it's something they have to maintain with attention to their mind, or we would say mindfulness today.
Wow. And what have you done to maintain this cognitive distancing, to look at the world more objectively and know when you're wearing catastrophe glasses or catastrophizing? How can someone identify that and then look at the world more objectively? Well,
there are many things that you can do, okay? So what the Stoics originally said is maybe, in a sense, the least helpful piece of advice they give is the one that I think they felt strongest about, which is that they think someone else can help you. They think we have a blind spot for our own strong emotions and cognitive biases. And so they say you need to find a mentor. Like today we'd have a coach or a therapist or whatever. And in ancient philosophy, it's very different from the way that we think of philosophy today. You know, ancient philosophers did something that was almost like confession in the Catholic Church. So, and they would give someone permission to criticize them and examine their moral conscience and so on. We have a book describing this process by Galen, Marcus Aurelius's court physician, who was not a Stoic, but had studied the Stoics. And Galen wrote a book called On the Diagnosis and Cure of the Soul's Passions, which we have today. And it's a book about a kind of psychotherapy, and it refers to earlier Stoic books on psychotherapy. And Galen says there's one of Aesop's fables that says everyone is born with two bags hanging around their necks. Have you ever heard this story? Did you know you have two bags hanging around your neck? So they say, Aesop said you have a big bag hanging in front of you, right under your face all of the time, on your chest. And do you know what it contains?
No.
It contains everybody else's flaws, Aesop said. And he said, and you've also got a little bag that hangs behind your neck, and you can never see it properly because it's always just behind your head. And do you know what that contains?
Your own flaws.
Your own flaws. So he said you have a blind spot for it. And that was the way that Galen expressed it. And he said, so you need to find somebody who'll be completely brutally honest with you and has the wisdom and experience to be able to tell you, highlight to you when you're being prejudiced or bigoted or cowardly or unjust. And Marcus Aurelius tells us at the beginning of the Meditations that he had a Stoic mentor who persuaded him that he needed therapia, Stoic therapy. And his name was Junius Rusticus. And he was a senior Roman statesman and a Stoic philosopher. And Marcus tells us that sometimes he would get very annoyed with Rusticus. But he also said Rusticus was very adept at resolving arguments, which Marcus was as well, right? So the person he got most annoyed with was also the guy who taught him how to repair relationship after they'd had an argument. Now, that's of limited value to us because you have therapy and coaching, you can find mentors and stuff today, but many people struggle to find somebody like that. So the Stoics, I think, realized that one of the problems with finding a mentor. So I think it's Seneca that says the early Stoics, the founder of Stoicism was a guy called Zeno of Citium, and Seneca says, look, the early Stoics were lucky because they knew Zeno, they lived with him. Some of them shared a house with him, and they hung around with him all day. So they got to learn from physically being in the company of this guy. He was like a coach for Stoicism. But do you know what the problem is with Zeno?
What was the problem? That he died?
He's dead. He only lasted, 70 years and 10 or whatever, and then now he's 6 foot under pushing up daisies. And he has been for a really long time, right? But the Stoics were like, there's a problem. Mentors die, right? And also people get thrown in prison or they get exiled or, people travel and stuff like that. So obviously they were like, what do you do when you don't have a mentor? Even if you happen to be best buddies with Socrates or Zeno, he's not going to be around forever. He's not always going to be there. So they had to introduce psychological techniques to use as a substitute. And we have a number of descriptions of those. And they take different forms. But one of them is the whole of Book 1 of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, in which Marcus describes at great length the virtues or the most admirable qualities of about 16 or 17 of his friends and family members, mainly his family members and his teachers. And so Marcus does this extended, elaborate meditation where he describes in meticulous detail, in particular, his adoptive father, the preceding emperor, Antoninus Pius's character traits. And, Marcus kind of really reflects on what made him such a great leader. And this is about 15 years after Antoninus Pius had died that Marcus is still writing this and still meditating on this guy and, really trying to role model him and emulate him. So one thing they would do is just think about people they admire and really carefully try to analyze what qualities they can learn from them. And it could also be a fictional character. It wouldn't even need to be a real person. It could be a historical figure. It's what we would call today a modeling technique. And the other thing they do, they describe several times a technique that comes from a famous ancient text called the Golden Verses of Pythagoras. And the Stoics were interested in the Pythagoreans, this very ancient pre-Socratic school of philosophy. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, wrote a book about Pythagoreanism that's lost today, but we know the Stoics admired the Pythagoreans in many ways. And so they take this passage from the Golden Verses that says, each night you shouldn't allow your eyes to close until at least 3 times you've reviewed the main events of the day and ask yourself 3 questions about them. What did I do well? What did I do badly? And what could I do differently tomorrow? Boom. And Seneca describes essentially the same process in some detail in a book that survives today called On Anger. And so he says every evening he engages in this contemplative practice where he says he treats it as if he's giving advice to a friend. I think he compares it to also cross-examining a witness in court, which is a very famous metaphor. It's the same metaphor that Socrates uses for the Socratic method. And so he says it has to be done gently, not in an aggressive or a punitive, critical way, but as if you're talking to a friend and you're trying to really help them compassionately. So he said he's creating a split here. He's taking a step back and he's viewing himself as if he was his own mentor. He's becoming his own therapist or his own mentor. And literally at the end of the day, picturing himself from the outside and taking a step back and looking at himself 3 times and then thinking what he did badly, what he did well, what he omitted to do that he could do differently next time. Creating this systematic approach to self-improvement.
And I think it's great because it's so hard for you to find the right mentor or the right mentors. Mm-hmm. And coaching yourself, I think, is something that's available for everyone. Uh-huh. But I still want to know, how do we get rid of this bias that we it's harder for us to see our own flaws than other people's flaws?
Mm-hmm.
Is it by establishing these practices daily? How have you implemented it in your life, for example?
I think doing it consistently, first of all, and also talking to people, putting yourself out there, and actually, the best advice that I can give you is people talk a lot. Do you ever notice that people sometimes talk a lot without saying anything? So, people talk a lot about self-improvement, right? I've spent my whole life studying psychotherapy and self-improvement, psychology and philosophy. I'm amazed at the things that people don't talk about, like the huge gaps in the conversation. It seems to me people avoid talking about some of the more important and fundamental questions. I'll give you an example, right? The internet is awash with self-improvement podcasts and advice and information, but not that much of it addresses anger. And I think anger is the royal road to self-improvement. In many ways, it's the easiest way to begin self-improvement, I think, for a number of reasons. But people tend to avoid questioning and challenging their own anger. And we know there are reasons for that. Anger is an externalizing emotion. So when people are anxious or depressed, they tend to self-blame. So they'll think, why am I so anxious? Why am I so depressed? I better go and see a therapist and get help. So they're more likely to go and see therapists. Angry people don't go to see therapists as much. An angry person would say, you need therapy, buddy. Because they think everybody else is wrong. They blame other people, right? So angry people tend not to come to therapy unless their wife tells them to, or their husband tells them to, or their boss tells them to. And then someone else says, no, you need therapy because you're angry all the time, right? But they tend not to refer themselves. So they have a pronounced blind spot. But also anger is an inherently interpersonal emotion, generally speaking. Anger is directed towards other people. So I think because of its interpersonal nature, there's more opportunity for angry people to get feedback and get an external perspective. They'll get pushback against their anger more. Your angry words and attitudes towards other people are more likely to result in pushback from other people and being challenged or questioned than someone's depression would. Depressed people just sit at home and be depressed. Like angry people go out and they criticize and insult other people, and other people say, you're being ridiculous, you're a bigot, and so there's more opportunity for angry people to be brought to self-awareness if only they'll listen to the things that other people are saying in response to them. It's the fact that it's interpersonal gives us more opportunity to say, what are other people saying every time you lose your temper? How does it work out for, there's more evidence for you. Like you can get your objectivity by looking at other people and listening to them and seeing how they respond to your angry outbursts, like in your bigoted, speech online or whatever it is that people do. So I think focusing on anger is a tip. And also just really, like you guys are doing in your podcast, in a sense, you're making more of an effort to talk about the most important things in life. And this might sound a trivial way to put it, but Socrates said many complex and very profound things. And Socrates is really the granddaddy of everything that we're talking about here, right? He's, in my view, he's the great granddaddy of this entire tradition. But, the main thing Socrates said to people is, you guys should spend more time talking about the most important things in life, which sounds like a kind of oddly simple, trivial thing. But he said, but you're not. You guys what's the most important thing in life? He would say to people, what's the goal of life? What do you think's what is it that makes somebody admirable? And people go, I don't know, I haven't really thought about it much, Socrates. And Socrates would say, how can you say that on the one hand, this is the most important thing in life, and on the other hand, that you've never really talked about it or really thought about it that much? Yeah. He was very good at putting people on the spot like that. So people talk about self-improvement and stuff, but they often don't really really engage with these questions. What is the goal of life? What's the most important thing in life? What is it that actually gives life value? What does happiness consist in? These are the big questions that I think, people would benefit greatly from spending more time engaging with. And the very fact of doing that, I think, helps them to gain more self-awareness. And then cognitive distancing, for a number of reasons. There are reasons psychologically. And maybe I can explain this very briefly. When we become emotional, one of the many things that happens, strong emotions like anger and anxiety put your brain in a different state. It's a whole different ballgame, buddy. Like your brain just goes in a different mode of functioning, right? That's the most simple thing that people need to realize. Simple truths are the most important ones. Your brain's in a different mode of functioning. And a bunch of things happen. But one of the things that happens is that you become locked into your perspective. So normally, if we're talking about something that we don't have strong feelings about, say, a conversation that we listen to, and you might say, well, it kind of seems like maybe that guy was being a bit rude to that woman, but I guess you could view it from another way. I guess, there's probably I guess someone else might see it differently. So normally we can entertain multiple perspectives. Isn't that weird? We can go, I guess you could see it this way, or possibly you could see it that way. So we have cognitive flexibility, and we're not really locked into any particular one. It's like we're kind of juggling several different views on the same thing. We can move around, look at things from different angles. When somebody's angry, you don't do that. Like, they just go, that guy's an idiot, boom, and they lock in, and they find it hard to move around and view it from different angles. And that, it's almost like they're now trapped in a cage. They're trapped in that one perspective. And so when we gain cognitive distance, and there are number of ways that we can do that, when we start to realize that we're wearing tinted glasses, that frees us to shift around between different perspectives, and that helps us to notice our blind spots and regain objectivity. And it was sort of this, one of the questions that even Socrates used to ask people that can help with that is just saying, do other people feel the same way about this? And that simple question alone can help nudge people out of their fused attitudes and get them to regain an element of objectivity and flexibility.
So do other people feel the same way about this?
Mm-hmm.
I love that question.
Yeah, he asks that a lot, and the Stoics tend to ask similar questions to encourage people to realize that if you view something as a catastrophe, someone else might view it as an opportunity. And also, here's something even weirder, right? Here's another little mind game. So say you lose your job. It's a catastrophe, right? It's awful. But someone else might think it's an opportunity. They might go, this is a chance to start that business that I've been thinking about, or switch careers or something. I'll just have a break, right? I'll be short of money for a while, but then eventually I'll find something else. They might view it very differently in a more constructive way. But here's an even weirder thing, right? Let's say you currently view it as a catastrophe. Your future self, looking back on it, might view it very differently. So you don't even need to think about other people's perspectives. Even your own perspective, further ahead in the future, might reframe it as having been an opportunity. And often you say to people, well, 2 years from now, when you look back on this, how do you think you're going to feel differently about it? And how might you view it differently? Like, even their own perspective over time might change. And so you can gain a certain amount of flexibility and therefore increased objectivity just by projecting yourself into the future and looking back on events.
It's so important how we frame setbacks. I find it very interesting how Marcus Aurelius, for example, views setbacks as painful medicine that's there to improve his character. I feel that if we just have this cognitive tools that the Stoics use and that you're talking about now, that could really help improve our character as a whole.
Yeah, I think so. There's a famous story that you remind me of. Epictetus, we mentioned earlier, is a famous Stoic teacher. He tells a story about a guy called Paconius Agrippinus, who was a Roman statesman who was critical of the emperor, a tyrannical emperor. I can't remember whether now, it was either Domitian or Nero, one of the two of them. Anyway, so Agrippinus was having lunch with his friends, and the emperor sent his guards, the Praetorian guards, presumably, and they said, you've been sent into exile, which is a terrible thing. It's a catastrophe for most Roman noblemen. And Agrippinus knew that he would have to travel through the Italian countryside to Brundisium, the port, and he said to his friends, well, we'll pack up the food because there's a really nice spot on the road where we could stop and have a picnic, right? So he makes this weird positive reframe of it. But Epictetus tells us something else about him. He says Agrippinus did this all the time. And he said he would do it with exile, poverty, illness. And he said he actually wrote letters to himself, which he calls, he describes as a eulogium, like a letter praising catastrophes. So if, he was concerned about going bankrupt or something, Agrippinus would write a letter to himself praising bankruptcy as an opportunity, like systematically reframing actually in writing in the form of a letter.
How important is it to put it down on paper rather than just thinking about it? Does it help a lot more?
I think it varies depending on the individual. This is the advice I would give people. I think people sometimes are kind of thrown by, the more you study psychology, self-improvement techniques and psychotherapy techniques, I guess it's like many other subjects, right? You start off learning practical techniques. Of course, you start with concrete examples. So you say, like, maybe you do this particular relaxation technique, or you write this thing down in this way on a piece of paper. And then as you get deeper into a subject, your understanding of it becomes higher level, more abstract, and you think less in terms of specific tactics and more in terms of general strategies. And you think you don't have to do it that way. There's other ways that you could achieve the same result, right? Writing a letter on a piece of paper might be one way of doing it. Having a conversation with somebody might be another way of doing it. Someone might draw a diagram or close their eyes and visualize it. So there are many different forms the same basic strategy could take. Now, the reason that I think that's important is that the level of specific tactics is not for everybody. Right. So there are definitely some people who benefit from sitting down and writing a letter to themselves. And we know in psychotherapy, there are certain individuals for whom that would be quite unhelpful. So people who engage in ruminative thinking and overthink everything are not good candidates sometimes for doing journaling or writing exercises. Because in therapy, you might say, go away and write down all of your negative thoughts and come back next week and we'll evaluate, write down the main one. We'll come back next week and we'll evaluate them. It's a thing that therapists would do. There's certain types of clients who will then come back with a big pile of papers. And so for them, having written down the thoughts is not a therapeutic strategy. They've turned it into something that's symptomatic of their problem. They're overthinking. They're going and getting lost in the weeds and going into too much detail. So some people writing a letter, they might just encourage them to overthink things, whereas for other people it might be helpful. But the basic idea, the underlying strategy is what matters, even if you find different ways of doing it.
So we should look at the idea, for example, reframing.
It's the idea of reframing. Yeah,
what I couldn't hear. Could you repeat it?
It's the idea or the strategy of reframing it, focusing on looking at it from a different perspective, seeing it as an opportunity. There's other ways you could do that. You could do it just by talking to someone about it and asking them how they might see it differently. You could do it by imagining one of your heroes, by modeling, by picturing how would Epictetus view this situation, and just contemplating that. You could do it by picturing yourself in the future, having overcome a problem, looking back on it, and imagine seeing it from that perspective. You could do it visually, you could do it verbally, you could do it on your own, you could do it with the help of another person, but these are all just different ways of achieving the same reframing strategy.
So we should definitely try different techniques and see what works for us.
You need to try different techniques and see what works with you. Say you want to teach someone how to relax in therapy. For some people, you might teach them how to tense individual muscles and then relax them. Other people, you might teach a breathing exercise to relax. Other people, you might show them a visualization technique or give them an audio recording to listen to in order to relax. And, people are different. So, you have to take account of their personal preferences. Not every tactic works for every person, but the general underlying strategy might be similar. You might have to do it in different ways for different people.
And this last point I want to touch on is why do you think that now confusing pleasure for happiness is something that's very common in our society?
I believe that I'll tell you what my view about that is. So first of all, I don't think this is the root cause of it, but I'll mention it in passing that in the English language, maybe other languages as well, but certainly the English language, the word, and many people are just unaware of this, the word happiness is an interesting word. Like, if I ask a bunch of people what makes them happy, they'll say watching Netflix, eating chocolate, and drinking a nice glass of wine or something like that, right? Things like that, right? But the word happiness used to mean something different not that long ago. And there's evidence of that in our language. If you look in the dictionary now, occasionally people will use the word hapless, which means wretched and unfortunate. And hapless means the opposite of what the word happy used to mean. Happy used to mean fortunate and flourishing and doing well, right? But it became degraded over time so that it simply referred to a kind of superficial, subjective feeling. Feeling happy is not the same as actually flourishing, right? So somebody might be high as a kite on some narcotic and feeling happy in this superficial sense, but we might describe them as being hapless, like wretched and unfortunate, yeah? So, and not in the original, not in the meaning of the word happy that we use when we talk about Greek philosophy refers to actual flourishing. For the Greeks, to say someone had eudaimonia, to say they were eudaimon, or the word that's traditionally translated as happy, would mean that you would look at them and think, I want to be that guy. Like, I really admire him. Not just that he's got a big smile on his face, because somebody, might be an idiot and they, they might be high as a kite and have a big smile. They might not be flourishing at all. They might be quite wretched and hapless, but experiencing hedonia or pleasure. So we've confused these things so much that the very word happiness has become degraded in the English language. It's interesting how far we've wandered, like, from meaningful conversations that in the past people used to be able to have. We don't even have the language anymore to easily discuss the most important things in life. Socrates would look at us and think, you guys, I told you, discuss the most important things in life. You've gone so far off the track now. You've even forgotten what some of the words mean that we used to use to have these conversations. How weird is that, right? So now I'll tell you what I think. I'm not sure about this, but this is my feeling about it. I think when you're born, you thrown into the world, and you gradually develop language and self-awareness as you're growing up as a small child. And unfortunately, it's kind of, the process is back to front. So you begin looking around you as a child and emulating what you see other people doing. So small children will look at, if there's a loud bang, what does a 2-year-old do? They immediately look at their parents' reaction, like, to see, if they're freaking out or not. And then they'll copy it. If their parents freak out, then the child will start busting into tears as well, like, because it looks for cues from the adults around them and it copies them, right? So that our initial phase, like, there's a lot of emulation. The children are just modeling what's going on around them. And before we can even talk, right? So we are modeling external behavior, what we see people doing on the outside, right? And that shapes our personalities and our underlying values. And by the time we develop language and reason and self-awareness, it's too late, right? We're already on this path of looking around us and getting our values and our direction in life from what we see other people doing. Now, unfortunately, what people do, what we see them doing every day, is quite different from what they claim is the most important thing in life. So everybody will say, well, what really matters is being true to your values and all that kind of good stuff. And then you watch what people are doing and how they're behaving. And a lot of what you see is them avoiding discomfort, like chasing superficial pleasures, protecting their ego, like all that superficial stuff. And then we act with it. Why are people so superficial? Like, because when you look around, that's what you see all around you. Everyone's running it. Like, everyone seems to be trying to get money, like, and impress other people. Like, and so as children, that's all we see. Like, and then we get language and reason, and we start to reflect and question and think, and we go, maybe money doesn't really make you happy. But now it's too late, right? Because we're enmeshed in a system of values where, you know, we've grown up like surrounded by people that seem to be accumulating material possessions as if it's like, you know, as if it's the most important thing in the world. So I think it has to do in part with the fact that we begin developing through non-verbal learning and observation of people's external behavior. And, you know, it may be that when we question people about why they're trying to accumulate money, for example, that they would say, well, I'm doing it to protect my family or something like that. There's some other motive for doing it that maybe is a little bit more profound, but we don't necessarily see that on the outside. So we're bound to acquire superficial values when we model people's external behavior without questioning them more deeply about their underlying goals and motives. But, you know, it takes maturity and time before we get an opportunity to do that. So I for that reason, I don't think it's surprising that throughout history, people end up being hedonistic and egotistical and falling into the same trap generation after generation. I think it's just the way that human life is and the way that our brains and bodies are designed that leaves us vulnerable to making these errors.
You described it very beautifully, and you just blew my mind right now. So let's say you have fallen in this trap because you're modeling other people's behavior. What can you start doing? Should you start questioning your values? Should you start questioning other people's values? What can you start doing to sort of dig yourself out of this hole?
You should ask yourself, like, so one of the questions, there are many things that you can do, and reading the Stoics will give you lots of cues and lots of ideas. So reading the Stoics is a good guide. But for instance, the Stoics thought that we should, here's a trick. Here's a trick that Socrates invented, right? I'll tell you a story. One day, a 15-year-old boy called Critobulus came to Socrates and said, I need your help with something. And Critobulus was the son of one of Socrates' best friends, his lifelong friend, the guy that he grew up with, called Crito, who was a wealthy landowner. And he was kind of patron to Socrates. So Socrates wanted to help his son. So in Athenian society, this boy was just about to become an adult and enter adult society. And Socrates, there's many paradoxical things about. So although he looked like a bit of a tramp or a beggar, he went around barefoot and stuff. He was kind of scruffy. He also knew all the movers and shakers in Athens. Like, he knew a lot of influential and powerful people, aristocrats and statesmen, and like highly accomplished generals and artists. Like, he was a strange guy like that, Socrates. So this young guy was like, Socrates, could you introduce me to some of the famous and important people? You know, he said, I need to make friends. Like, he's asking him for networking help, right? And he says, could you help me with network? Could you help me get introduced to the best people, like to make the right friends? Like, because I'm just about to turn 15 and I want to make sure that I get with the right network in Athenian society. And Socrates always starts off with kind of banal questions. That's why a lot of people don't read the Socratic dialogues today, because people today don't have as much patience as they did in the past before television, like the internet and stuff. People were happier to spend longer wading through long texts. And so you get a couple of pages into some of the Socratic dialogues and you think, why is he asking all these stupid questions? Like, but you have to push a little bit further, right? So the first question Socrates says are, look, what qualities would you look for in the ideal friend then? And they have this banal conversation about, well, you know, I'd look for how would they treat you if you were sick? I guess they'd come and visit me, you know, and they'd help me find a good doctor. What if you were broke? Well, maybe they'd lend me money. And what if you were kind of going off the rails and falling in with bad company? I guess they'd take me aside and give me some advice or something like that. So have this banal conversation about what qualities are possessed by an ideal friend, or defining the qualities of the ideal friend. And you'd be reading this and thinking, whatever, like this is, it's kind of not telling me anything that I don't really know already, Socrates. So a lot of people maybe stop reading the dialogue at that point. But if they read a little bit further, Socrates then does what he usually does. He asks a shocking question that changes the whole tone of the dialogue. So he says to Critobulus, so how many of these qualities do you actually possess yourself? Mm. And Critobulus is kind of gobsmacked. He's like, none. And Socrates says, well, hang on a minute. So I think you're doing this all back to front, right? You've asked me to introduce you to the best friends that we could find. But if you don't have the qualities that would make you a good friend, not only are they going to figure that out, and then they're just going to kind of get fed up with you, not going to want to be friends with you, but it's also going to ruin my reputation as a sort of matchmaker of friends as well. So this is going to work out badly for everybody. And he said, but if you did it the other way around, if you'd come to me and said, Socrates, how could I make myself an ideal friend for others? Then I could help you do that. And he said the other part of it would take care of itself, because people would be falling over themselves to introduce you to the best people that they knew. If you'd really improved your care, if you were the type of person that you just described to me, then everyone would want to introduce you to their friends. You're going about this back to front. And Socrates often says to people, you confuse appearance with reality, like we talked about earlier. That was one of his big themes. So he said, you want to be presented to people as a good friend, right? You want me to say to them, Critobulus is an awesome guy, right? And that's what you've asked me to do. You've asked me to focus on appearances and present you to them in that way. You could have focused on reality and said, Socrates, could you actually make me into a good friend, like a wise and virtuous person, the sort of person that other people would want to be? You focused on the superficial aspect, the external aspect, rather than the inner core, the reality of it. Now, the reason that this dialogue is interesting is it uses something that in cognitive therapy we call the double standard strategy we use in therapy today. So a lot of people today will say, I don't really know, people are kind of nihilistic. They say, I don't really know what the goal is in life, what I should be doing. I feel kind of lost. That happens often in a society where there's a lot of exposure to other cultures and information. So people start to question their own traditions and values and preconceptions, and then often they'll feel kind of lost. They're like, I don't know what to believe anymore. So like the ancient Greeks found out about other countries and went, we've got our gods, but the Egyptians worship a bunch of different gods and the Persians worship, I don't know whose gods we should be worshipping now. So people started to kind of question things and feel more lost. And so often people will say, well, I don't know, what direction should I be heading in? But Socrates realized that if you ask them to describe the qualities that they would admire in another person, they're usually able to do that. But the gap is that they don't tend to apply it to themselves. So Socrates' point to Critobulus is, you already know what you should be trying to do. For some reason, though, this is your blind spot, right? You could tell me exactly what you think other people should be doing. It's like people are much better at fixing the problems of others, but Socrates is using that against him. He's turning it around and said, you've given me a perfect description of everything that you should be doing. Yeah. And so this feeling of being lost and not being able to see our own blind spots and so on, we can kind of trick ourselves out of it. He tricked Critobulus out of it just by getting him to focus on giving advice to someone else and the qualities that he would most admire in someone else. A really simple strategy that Socrates uses a number of times in Plato's dialogues and also in the dialogues of Xenophon. So I think that's another thing that people can benefit from doing today that can, help them regain a sense of genuine value, by taking a step out of their own perspective, focusing, on the qualities. The Stoics do this a lot. We don't have role models today, right? If you say to people, who are your heroes, right? Everyone knows. Who are your heroes? They'll go, I don't know, some guy that was on Big Brother, or like, Cardi B or something like, somebody of dubious, like, or you may think they have admirable qualities, right? But people tend to focus on celebrities, right? Because they've got lots of money and they're famous, right? But the Stoics think we need to push deeper and really, ask ourselves in a more challenging way, what do we really admire in other people? What are the qualities that we genuinely admire in other people? And then how many of those qualities do we actually possess ourselves? And what are we doing in order to instantiate those qualities each day in our own lives? And they would say, Socrates would say, and the Stoics would say, that's all the roadmap that you need. You already know what you're supposed to be doing. But you just kind of have a bit of a blind spot for it. And it's not that difficult by using the double standard strategy to get yourself out of it. But again, look at book 1 of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. He spends the entire book going into great detail about the qualities that he most admires in other people, so that he could spend the rest of the book figuring out how he can become more like that himself, so that in a sense he can look himself in the mirror and think, I respect that guy. I admire the person that I've become. That's happiness rather than pleasure, right? This is, I believe, that what you were talking about, happiness, eudaimonia, is the kind of satisfaction or fulfillment that comes from being able to look yourself in the mirror and feel that it's self-love, right? In the rational sense, not in the superficial sense, but to look yourself in the mirror and think, I actually like myself. I actually like the type of person that I'm becoming. Like, genuinely, I feel like I'm on the right track in life. And that starts with being able to figure out what it is that you genuinely admire about other people.
Well, you couldn't have described it any better, Donald. Is there anything else that you'd like to say, or anything you want to promote specifically?
Well, I should plug an event. So I'm one of the founding members of the Modern Stoicism organization, which was set up in 2012 by Christopher Gill, who's Professor Emeritus of Ancient Thought at Exeter University. And it's a non-profit organization run by a multidisciplinary team of volunteers. So this is why I'm always plug it on podcasts and stuff. It's a non-profit. And it's a philanthropic organization. So it runs courses and conferences, and it helps people to publish articles about Stoicism, people from all over the world. And tens of thousands of people have done the courses that Modern Stoicism runs. Now, because of the pandemic, the annual conference, which last year was in Athens, where I'm at the moment, it was going to be in Toronto, but we switched it to being an online conference for the first time. And actually, I think we talked earlier about kind of reversals of fortune. I'll leave people to think about although the pandemic is a bad thing in many obvious ways, like, there are opportunities that the pandemic presents to people, and some people have been improved by lockdown and by coming to terms with their own mortality and things like that. So there are positive aspects even of a public health catastrophe like the pandemic. So we thought that, we're not going to be able to run our conference. We'll have to do it online instead. And now that we've done it online, we've got probably 2 to 3 times as many people attending it. So we thought, actually, maybe this is better in some ways anyway. Maybe we should have been doing this sooner. So we have the online conference. We have about 14 speakers, like authors, experts, academics from all over the world talking about Stoicism. And it's by donation. Because it's online, it's cheaper. So this year we thought, well, we can allow people just to choose how much they want to pay. So you could pay $1 if you want, or you could pay $1,000. It's up to you if you're a wealthy philanthropist and you're feeling generous, But that's nice for us, because it means, well, people that are in poorer countries or students can just pay, the price of a cup of coffee if they want, and they can still get to attend the conference. So that's on the 17th of October. And it's a great opportunity to listen to a bunch of authors and academics and people that are trying to apply Stoicism in daily life. And if you go to the modernstoicism.com website, then you'll find all the information about that and the full program of speakers.
Thank you so much, Donald. It's been amazing talking to you, man. I learned so much.
Well, likewise, it's been a pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for inviting me on your show.